He had the brightest smile in music, but his reality was a living hell. The fifth Beatle sang love songs to millions, yet the industry strictly forbade him from loving a man. Trapped between the conservative black church, the rigid heterosexual marketing of 1970s R&B, and the terror of the AIDS epidemic, Billy Preston was forced to completely hide that he was gay. The machine exploited his talent for profit, leaving him to drown in crippling loneliness, drugs, and prison. A musical genius spent his entire life healing others, but was forced by the system to destroy himself. Born William Everett Preston on September 2, 1946 in Houston, Texas, his early life was immediately shaped by familial transition. Following his parents' divorce, a young Billy relocated to Los Angeles, California, with his mother, Robbie Lee Williams. This relocation was part of a broader demographic shift of Black Americans moving westward in the post-war era, seeking economic stability and community. For Robbie Lee Williams, the epicenter of this new community in Los Angeles was the church. Williams was a devout woman who found her calling and social standing as a church choir director. Consequently, the church was not merely a place of Sunday worship for the Preston family. It was the central organizing principle of their daily lives. The black church in 1950s Los Angeles served as a vital social, political, and cultural sanctuary, insulated from the systemic racism of the outside world. Musically, it was a rigorous training ground. The gospel tradition demanded absolute emotional commitment, exceptional vocal control, and an intrinsic understanding of complex rhythmic structures. It was within this immersive, highly disciplined environment that Billy Preston's extraordinary aptitude for music first emerged. Preston was a documented child prodigy. He began teaching himself to play the piano at the age of 3, replicating the melodies he heard his mother rehearsing with her choir. By the time he was 10 years old, he had graduated from the piano to the church organ, specifically the Hammond console. Mastering the Hammond organ is a physically and mentally demanding task. It requires the independent coordination of both hands on separate keyboards, the manipulation of drawbars to alter the tone, and the simultaneous use of both feet to play the bass pedal board. For a 10-year-old child to not only physically manage this instrument, but to play it with the rhythmic authority and emotional depth required for gospel worship was an anomaly that immediately elevated his status within the community. The church leadership quickly recognized his exceptional talent, showcasing him as a musical fixture in their religious services. He was no longer just a congregant. He was a designated vessel for spiritual expression, playing alongside renowned gospel figures like Mahalia Jackson and James Cleveland when they passed through Los Angeles. However, this environment of spiritual sanctuary also served as the site of severe, undocumented trauma. The strict hierarchical structure of the mid-century church demanded absolute obedience and reverence for religious authority figures. For a child prodigy constantly surrounded by older, powerful adults, this power dynamic left him uniquely vulnerable. According to rare, guarded confessions from Preston later in his life, the unquestioned authority structures within the church failed to protect him. He disclosed that during these formative years, he was subjected to profound exploitation by a touring gospel pianist and, on a separate occasion, by a local pastor. The cultural dictates of the era, combined with the church's foundational role in his mother's life and their social survival, mandated absolute silence. The institution that celebrated his public talent was the same institution that harbored those who preyed upon him. To speak out would have risked dismantling his mother's standing in the community and destroying the only support system they had. This forced suppression of his deepest trauma established a lifelong psychological pattern. From an incredibly young age, Billy Preston learned to sever his internal reality from his public performance. He learned that his value to the adults around him was inextricably linked to his ability to produce joyful, uplifting music, regardless of his own pain. The church provided him with the musical vocabulary that would eventually make him a global superstar, but it simultaneously enforced a code of silence that would dictate the trajectory of his personal life. The sanctuary had become a place of profound danger, teaching him that survival required hiding his true self behind the safety of the keyboard. The transition from the religious sanctuary to the secular entertainment industry occurred before Billy Preston even reached adolescence. In 1958, at the age of 11, his musical dexterity and undeniable screen presence led to his casting in the Paramount Pictures biographical film St. Louis Blues. Portraying the young blues composer W.C. Handy, Preston shared the screen with established titans of Black American music, including Nat King Cole, Pearl Bailey, and Mahalia Jackson. This early exposure to the Hollywood studio system provided a rigorous, informal education. He observed how performers like Cole, who faced intense racial hostility from mainstream audiences, maintained an ironclad, dignified public composure. The set of St. Louis Blues demonstrated the extreme behavioral control required of Black entertainers operating within a predominantly white corporate framework. For a child raised in the strict doctrinal environment of the church, stepping into the realm of secular rhythm and blues was a significant cultural transgression. Mid-century Black communities often maintained a rigid boundary between gospel and what was frequently dismissed as the devil's music. The economic realities of the professional music business, however, necessitated this crossover. Preston navigated this divide by prioritizing his utility as a working musician. He treated his talent not merely as a spiritual gift, but as a highly adaptable trade skill. This pragmatic approach allowed him to secure steady session work in Los Angeles, playing behind prominent secular artists while still maintaining his ties to the gospel circuit. The most critical phase of Preston's professional and psychological development began in 1962 when the 16-year-old musician was hired to join the touring band of rock and roll architect Little Richard. Richard was a figure of immense complexity, a pioneer who embodied the volatile collision of the Black church, secular commerce, and a flamboyant, barely concealed queer identity. Touring with Richard offered Preston a front row seat to the severe contradictions of the music industry. He watched Richard constantly vacillate between performing hyperkinetic, sexually charged rock and roll and suffering agonizing bouts of religious guilt that would periodically drive him back to the ministry. More importantly, Preston observed how the industry managers, promoters, and record executives handled Richard. They capitalized entirely on his electrifying stage persona while actively suppressing the realities of his sexuality. The industry demanded a specific caricature to sell records, and any deviation from that profitable image was met with swift commercial punishment. For a young, closeted musician already carrying the weight of early trauma, witnessing Little Richard's public struggles served as a stark cautionary tale. It reinforced the unwritten rule that survival in this business required absolute compartmentalization. This same 1962 tour with Little Richard brought Preston to the Reeperbahn district of Hamburg, Germany. The Star Club was a notoriously rough, relentless venue where bands were contracted to play grueling, hours-long sets through the night. It was in this gritty, high-pressure environment that Preston first crossed paths with a struggling, pre-fame British rock group named the Beatles. Despite his youth, Preston was already a seasoned professional. He did not approach the older British musicians with the deference of a fan, but with the confidence of an equal. They bonded over their shared encyclopedic knowledge of American R&B and early rock records. The camaraderie established in the dressing rooms and on the stages of Hamburg created a foundation of mutual professional respect that would alter the course of music history nearly a decade later. Returning to the United States, Preston capitalized on his growing reputation as a faultless, highly adaptable sideman. By the mid-1960s, he secured a highly visible position as the resident keyboardist on the hit ABC television program Shindig. Network television during this era was bound by severe racial and cultural anxieties. Black performers allowed onto primetime national broadcasts were required to adhere to incredibly narrow, non-threatening archetypes. The television cameras demanded a specific type of performance. The smiles had to be wide, the demeanor entirely accommodating, and the musical delivery flawless, but never overly aggressive. As a permanent fixture in the house band, playing behind a rotating cast of major stars ranging from Sam Cooke to the Rolling Stones, Preston perfected the art of the affable, indispensable sideman. He learned how to read the complex power dynamics of a rehearsal room, how to instantly adapt to a lead artist's vocal phrasing, and, crucially, how to project an image of pure, uncomplicated joy. The television studio became a masterclass in the curation of a safe public persona. By the time he reached his early 20s, Billy Preston possessed the resume and the hardened instincts of an industry veteran. He had absorbed the mechanics of survival in the American entertainment machine. He had witnessed the commercial rewards for compliance and the professional ruin awaiting those who revealed too much of their private lives. He emerged from this silent grind having constructed an impenetrable professional armor built upon undeniable instrumental virtuosity and an absolute enforced emotional opacity. The architecture of his public identity was now fully established, preparing him for a leap into unprecedented global fame. January 1969 marked a critical juncture in modern music history, unfolding within the freezing cavernous space of Twickenham Film Studios in London. The Beatles had convened to rehearse material for a proposed live television special. The sessions were characterized by profound dysfunction. The interpersonal dynamics of the band had deteriorated into open hostility, captured entirely by documentary film crews. The physical environment was cold, the acoustics were poor, and the collaborative spirit that had defined their earlier work had entirely vanished. The tension culminated in guitarist George Harrison temporarily walking out of the band. Seeking a respite from the animosity, Harrison attended a Ray Charles concert at the Royal Festival Hall. Performing in Charles's backing band, seated behind the Hammond organ, was Billy Preston. Harrison immediately recognized the 22-year-old musician from their shared grueling days on the Hamburg Club circuit earlier in the decade. Following the concert, Harrison extended an invitation for Preston to visit the Beatles at their new custom-built facility in the basement of Apple headquarters on Savile Row. When Preston arrived, the atmosphere inside the recording studio underwent an immediate documented transformation. The presence of a highly respected external musician forced John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr to abandon their internal grievances and behave with professional courtesy. Preston's contribution extended far beyond mere psychological mediation. The band was attempting a back-to-basics approach, recording live in the studio without the complex multi-tracking that defined their late 60s output. This stripped-down method required a robust, flawless rhythm section. Preston sat at the Fender Rhodes electric piano and immediately anchored the arrangements. His gospel-trained ear allowed him to anticipate McCartney's bass lines and lock in seamlessly with Starr's drumming. On the track Get Back, Preston's electric piano solo provided the rhythmic drive and blues inflection the song desperately needed. His playing was so integral to the final recordings of the Let It Be project that the band made an unprecedented decision. When the Get Back single was released to the public in April 1969, the label officially credited the track to the Beatles with Billy Preston. In the entire history of the world's most famous band, no other musician was ever granted co-billing on a record. This singular credit fundamentally altered the trajectory of Preston's career. He was immediately signed to the band's Apple Records label. Harrison produced his 1969 album, That's the Way God Planned It, and Preston performed the title track at the historic concert for Bangladesh in 1971, dominating the stage at Madison Square Garden with a frenetic, deeply physical vocal and organ performance. Following the dissolution of the Beatles and the subsequent folding of Apple Records, Preston transitioned to A&M Records, a label founded by Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss. It was here that he evolved from an elite, sought-after sideman into a global solo superstar. The early 1970s witnessed Preston's total domination of the Billboard charts. He introduced the percussive, syncopated sound of the Hohner clavinet to mainstream pop audiences with the 1971 instrumental funk track Outta Space, which earned him the Grammy Award for Best Pop Instrumental Performance. He proved equally formidable as a lead vocalist, securing massive multi-platinum #1 hits with Will It Go Round in Circles in 1973 and Nothing from Nothing in 1974. His profile was ubiquitous. He became the first musical guest on Saturday Night Live in 1975. Concurrently, he served as the primary touring keyboardist for the Rolling Stones during their most artistically and chemically volatile period. On the sprawling 1973 European tour and the monumental 1975 tour of the Americas, Preston was not relegated to the shadows. He commanded the stage alongside Mick Jagger, often given his own mid-set solo segment to perform his solo hits, whipping the massive stadium crowds into a frenzy. However, ascending to the absolute pinnacle of the music industry brought a new, severe set of restrictions. The transition from a supporting musician to a marquee solo artist meant that Preston was no longer just selling his keyboard skills. He was selling an image. The recording industry of the 1970s operated on strict demographic marketing strategies. R&B and soul music were undergoing a massive commercial expansion, and record labels aggressively curated the public personas of their biggest stars to maximize album sales and radio play. Within this specific commercial architecture, successful black male solo artists were almost exclusively positioned within a narrow archetype, the heterosexual romantic lead. The industry required its male vocalists to project an aura of masculine availability, serving as objects of desire for the female record-buying public. This marketing strategy dictated everything from lyrical content to stage wear, promotional photography, and interview talking points. For Billy Preston, this commercial requirement created an agonizing dissonance. He was a closeted homosexual man operating at the highest levels of an industry that demanded absolute convincing heterosexuality as a prerequisite for mainstream viability. A star of his magnitude operated within a massive corporate apparatus. His inner circle and label executives were acutely aware of his reality, yet they strictly enforced a code of silence to protect their commercial investment. Preston was forced to actively compartmentalize his identity. He stepped into recording booths and onto stadium stages radiating a safe, commercially viable energy, singing deeply emotive lyrics about romantic entanglements that did not reflect his reality. The industry actively protected this asset, steering journalists away from personal questions and carefully managing his public appearances. He was permitted to be flamboyant in his fashion, the massive afro, the towering platform shoes, the capes, because that extravagance was acceptable within the context of 1970s funk and soul showmanship. However, that physical expression could never cross the boundary into a genuine revelation of his private life. The industry demanded a commercially viable illusion. Even while orbiting the chaotic, sexually liberated tours of the Rolling Stones, Preston remained entirely isolated. He ruthlessly policed his own behavior, locked inside a heavily guarded, highly lucrative confinement that forced a musical genius to live a fragmented existence in plain sight. The transition from the 1970s into the 1980s marked a profound shift in both the commercial landscape of the American recording industry and the broader societal climate. For Billy Preston, this era represented a period of intensifying psychological pressure, dictated by historical forces entirely outside of his control. The musical aesthetic that had defined his peak commercial success, the organic, groove-oriented funk and soul driven by physical instrumentation, was rapidly being displaced. The ascendance of disco in the late 1970s, followed by the highly synthesized, drum machine-oriented R&B of the early 1980s, fundamentally altered the sonic requirements for radio airplay. Concurrently, the launch of MTV in 1981 transformed the music business into a strictly visual medium. The marketing of artists became intensely focused on highly stylized music videos, amplifying the physical scrutiny placed upon performers. The margin for maintaining a private life, already perilously thin in the previous decade, evaporated entirely under the glare of this new, visually demanding media apparatus. However, the shifting trends in pop music were secondary to a much larger, catastrophic historical event that began to unfold in the early years of the decade. In 1981, medical professionals in New York and California first began to report clusters of a rare, aggressive immune deficiency, appearing predominantly among young, otherwise healthy gay men. This marked the onset of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, a public health crisis that would fundamentally alter the cultural and social fabric of the late 20th century. The initial years of the epidemic were characterized by profound medical uncertainty, government inaction, and widespread public terror. Because the syndrome initially manifested most visibly within marginalized groups, specifically the gay community, the broader societal reaction was severely delayed and deeply prejudiced. The national media and figures within the political establishment frequently framed the unfolding medical disaster through a lens of moral judgment. The illness was publicly heavily stigmatized, often explicitly linked to discussions of morality, sin, and divine retribution. For a black man raised in the conservative traditions of the gospel church and operating within an R&B industry that prized traditional masculinity, the sudden emergence of this crisis created an environment of unprecedented hostility. The black church, which had provided Preston with his earliest musical education and remained a central pillar of his mother's life and his broader community, historically held highly conservative views regarding sexuality. During the early and mid-1980s, as the epidemic ravaged communities across the United States, many religious institutions adopted a stance of harsh condemnation rather than pastoral care. The theological rhetoric of the era frequently positioned the virus as a consequence of moral failing. Consequently, the church could not serve as a sanctuary or a source of support for closeted individuals facing this crisis. Instead, it represented a source of profound judgment and potential excommunication. Simultaneously, the entertainment industry offered no safe harbor. While the arts community was disproportionately devastated by the epidemic, the corporate apparatus of the recording industry remained intensely risk-averse. Record executives, promoters, and corporate sponsors viewed the crisis entirely through the lens of liability and public relations. Any association with the illness, or even rumors regarding a performer's sexuality that might suggest vulnerability to the illness, was considered commercially fatal. The industry response was not to offer medical or psychological support to its artists, but to aggressively double down on the enforcement of heterosexual imagery. Publicists worked overtime to suppress rumors, manufacture public relationships, and ensure that male artists projected an image completely detached from the realities of the crisis unfolding around them. This historical environment weaponized the closet. For Preston, living a concealed life was no longer merely a contractual obligation to ensure album sales. It became a daily psychological survival tactic fraught with mortal fear. The aggressive expansion of 1980s tabloid journalism meant illness itself became a form of non-consensual exposure. A sudden fluctuation in weight or a visible sign of fatigue could trigger a firestorm of media speculation threatening to instantly destroy a career built over decades. Preston was forced to navigate this minefield in total isolation. Many close to him during this period noted a deepening withdrawal. As a veteran of the music business, he possessed a vast network of colleagues, session musicians, and industry professionals. It is statistically certain that he witnessed peers within the broader entertainment and arts communities fall ill and pass away during the height of the epidemic. Yet the strictures of his public persona and the intense societal stigma prevented him from mourning openly attending memorials without raising suspicion, or seeking communal support. He was required to process the trauma of the era entirely alone, maintaining his signature gap-toothed smile and joyful stage presence while moving through an environment defined by grief and paranoia. As the 1980s progressed, Preston's presence on the Billboard pop charts as a solo artist began to wane. While he no longer commanded the massive solo stadium tours of the mid-70s, his peerless musicianship ensured he remained highly employed. He pivoted back to high-profile collaborative and session work, serving as a touring keyboardist for major heritage acts like Eric Clapton and Ringo Starr's all-star band. This professional shift provided a steady income and kept him adjacent to the spotlight, but it did not alleviate the psychological burden. He was still operating within the highest echelons of a heavily monitored industry. The cumulative weight of this specific historical era, the intersection of religious condemnation, corporate indifference, and a terrifying public health crisis, created a suffocating pressure cooker. Preston was trapped. He could not return to the spiritual sanctuary of his youth without facing profound rejection, and he could not look to his employers for anything other than continued demands for performance. The architecture of his life, built upon the rigorous compartmentalization he had learned as a child, was being tested to its absolute limits by a society gripped by fear. The relentless demand to provide musical joy to a world that fundamentally rejected his authentic self was a heavy toll, setting the stage for a period where his only reliable method of processing this reality was through the music itself. Behind the staggering volume of his recorded output during these peak years lay a desperate necessity. His music functioned not merely as a highly polished commercial product, but as a critical psychological exhaust system for a man living entirely in the shadows. Deprived of the ability to live openly and functioning within an industry that strictly monitored his public interactions, Preston's artistic output took on a vital, dual purpose. For the record-buying public and the radio programmers, his tracks were expertly crafted, accessible soul and pop anthems. They were designed to function within the commercial parameters of the era, providing soundtracks for social gatherings, romantic encounters, and daily life. However, for Preston himself, the music functioned as one of the few safe avenues for absolute emotional release. When analyzing his vocal performances, keyboard arrangements, and compositional choices, a distinct pattern emerges. His performances can be understood as coded confessions, a method of articulating deep yearning, unspoken truths, and profound isolation through the acceptable medium of the popular love song. This concept of coded communication has a deep, well-documented history within Black American music, originating in the spirituals of the enslaved, which frequently contained hidden messages regarding escape routes or impending plans, masked beneath religious allegory. As this musical tradition evolved into the secular forms of blues and eventually rhythm and blues, the technique of layering a public meaning over a private, concealed reality remained a standard artistic tool. Operating in the 1970s and 1980s, Preston continued this deeply rooted tradition of coded communication, utilizing the established tropes of the R&B love ballad to express an emotional extremity that he was strictly prohibited from demonstrating in his private life. His primary vehicle for this coded expression was the Hammond B3 organ, Preston was an undisputed master of the instrument, utilizing it to mimic the dynamic range and emotional timbre of the human voice. During live performances and in the recording studio, his solos transcended standard melodic improvisation. He weaponized the Hammond to articulate an aggressive, raw emotionality that his curated public persona strictly prohibited, allowing him to scream in a language the industry deemed commercially acceptable. The furious, driving organ solos on tracks like his instrumental hit Out of Space or his live performances with the Rolling Stones were not merely displays of technical virtuosity. They were physical, kinetic releases of pent-up psychological energy. The instrument allowed him to scream in a language that the industry deemed commercially acceptable. This dynamic is even more pronounced when analyzing his vocal delivery. Preston's voice was heavily rooted in the traditions of the Black Church, characterized by a slight, pleasing rasp, absolute pitch control, and the strategic use of melisma, the singing of a single syllable of text while moving between several different notes in succession. In the gospel tradition, these vocal techniques are utilized to convey the overwhelming transformative experience of spiritual possession or divine grace. Preston seamlessly transferred this religious vocal vocabulary into his secular pop records. However, without the theological context, the profound emotional weight of his delivery was redirected toward the subjects of romantic longing, heartbreak, and existential searching. The very anatomy of a standard Billy Preston ballad reveals a striking contradiction. The lyrical structure was generally mandated to be universal, ensuring maximum radio play and broad audience identification. Yet the vocal performance often betrayed a specific acute pain. When he delivered lyrics detailing the agony of a hidden relationship, the necessity of parting, or the desperate desire for a lasting connection, the performance was completely devoid of the performative distance often found in standard pop vocalists. He sang with the raw, immediate conviction of an individual whose survival depended on the act of singing itself. For a man living a deeply closeted life, constrained by religious guilt and corporate surveillance, the recording booth became the only environment where emotional honesty was permissible. A critical example of this dynamic is the classic ballad, You Are So Beautiful. While the song is most famously associated with Joe Cocker, historical consensus and the accounts of those present confirm that Billy Preston was a primary architect of the composition, collaborating heavily with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, though Preston remained uncredited on the original publishing. Preston frequently performed the song in his own live sets. The lyrics are incredibly sparse, relying on simple, repetitive declarations of devotion. However, when Preston performed the song, utilizing his slow, deliberate phrasing and allowing his voice to break slightly on the higher register, the simplicity of the lyrics transformed. It ceased to be a standard declaration of love and became a plea. Analyzed within the context of his concealed life, the song functions as a tribute to a type of love that he was systematically denied the ability to experience in the open. The emotional resonance of the performance stems from the friction between the ideal of the lyrics and the reality of the performer. This friction also existed within his most joyous, upbeat commercial hits. Tracks like Will It Go Round in Circles and Nothing from Nothing are characterized by infectious driving funk grooves, bright brass sections, and Preston's signature buoyant vocal delivery. They are designed to project absolute happiness. However, a closer examination of the lyrical content reveals a complex philosophical undercurrent. The lyrics often grapple with themes of uncertainty, the cyclical nature of failure, and the transactional reality of human relationships. Preston delivered these somewhat cynical or searching lyrics with an overwhelming, almost forced exuberance. This approach perfectly mirrored his broader survival strategy, masking complex internal turmoil beneath a flawless, highly entertaining exterior. He performed happiness so convincingly that the audience rarely questioned the reality behind the performance. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this career is acutely illustrated in his highly successful duet work, most notably the 1979 hit With You, I'm Born Again, recorded with Motown artist Syreeta Wright. The track is the quintessential late 1970s adult contemporary love song, heavily orchestrated and designed to serve as the ultimate soundtrack for heterosexual romance and wedding ceremonies. Preston's vocal performance on the track is masterful. He plays the role of the devoted traditional romantic lead perfectly, his voice weaving seamlessly with Wright's. Yet, the individual delivering this definitive anthem of traditional union was simultaneously navigating a life entirely excluded from that institution. He was constructing a fantasy for the public that he could not legally or socially inhabit himself. The psychological weight of continuously projecting these false narratives, no matter how beautifully executed, required an immense toll. The recording studio, therefore, operated as a complex space for Preston. It was primarily a place of commerce where he was expected to generate profitable intellectual property for his label, but it simultaneously functioned as a highly controlled confessional. When the heavy soundproof doors of the studio closed, and he was isolated in the vocal booth or seated alone at the piano, the external demands of his managers, the press, and the church were temporarily muted. In these moments of creation, he could translate the reality of his life into chord progressions, dynamic shifts, and vocal inflections. The producers and engineers focused on the technical fidelity and commercial viability of the sound, while the audience focused on the catchy melodies. The tragic irony of Billy Preston's peak artistic era is that his most profound communications were largely misunderstood by the millions of people who purchased his records. He was speaking clearly about isolation, desire, and the heavy burden of a hidden life, but he was forced to translate these truths into a language the industry could monetize. The sheer emotional power of his catalog is directly proportional to the suppression he faced in his personal life. The music was not merely an expression of his talent. It was a necessary psychological exhaust system. He had a voice capable of healing and comforting the masses, but the historical realities of his era ensured that the one truth he most needed to express had to remain permanently encrypted within the grooves of the vinyl. The human capacity to maintain a rigidly compartmentalized existence is not infinite. For decades, Billy Preston had successfully operated a complex psychological architecture, separating the deeply conservative reality of his upbringing and the strict commercial demands of his profession from his private, unacknowledged identity. He had utilized his profound musical talent as a highly effective exhaust system, channeling the isolation of a closeted life into universally accepted pop anthems. However, as the timeline shifted into the late 1980s and early 1990s, the structural integrity of this defense mechanism began to critically fail. The prolonged, unyielding stress of living a dual life, compounded by the historical terror of the AIDS epidemic and the shifting loyalties of the music industry, eventually transitioned from a purely psychological burden into a severe physical and behavioral collapse. The coping mechanisms that had once allowed him to navigate the entertainment business mutated into instruments of rapid self-destruction. The definitive breaking point that accelerated this downward spiral was a highly publicized and deeply traumatic event in his personal life. In a documented effort to align himself with the heterosexual expectations of his industry and silence persistent rumors regarding his private life, Preston entered into a high-profile engagement with actress and model Kathy Silva. For a brief period, this relationship provided the exact narrative the record labels and the mainstream press demanded, a successful traditional romantic partnership that reinforced his bankable public image. However, this strategic attempt at conformity ended in a devastating, highly public humiliation. It was widely reported and later confirmed by those within their immediate social circle that Silva abandoned the engagement to pursue a relationship with Preston's close friend and musical contemporary, the funk pioneer Sly Stone. This betrayal was not merely a romantic disappointment. It represented the total collapse of his final, most desperate attempt to build a socially acceptable life. This singular, deeply public humiliation served as his definitive breaking point. The realization that even when he attempted to play by the strict, exclusionary rules of his era, he was still subjected to profound indignity, shattered his remaining psychological defenses. Stripped of his protective barriers and navigating an industry that offered no structural support for mental health crises, Preston began a severe downward trajectory. The immediate manifestation of this psychological rupture was a rapid descent into severe chemical dependency. While the music industry of the 1970s was notoriously saturated with recreational drug use, Preston had largely maintained the discipline required of a highly sought-after session musician and touring bandleader. However, in the aftermath of his personal crises, his relationship with narcotics fundamentally changed. He turned to crack cocaine, a highly addictive, potent substance that had devastated American cities and quietly infiltrated the elite circles of the entertainment industry during the 1980s. For an individual carrying the specific suffocating weight of Preston's life, the appeal of this specific narcotic was devastatingly logical. Cocaine provides an immediate artificial surge of dopamine, temporarily overriding feelings of inadequacy, isolation, and profound grief. More importantly, it acts as a powerful numbing agent. It allowed him temporarily to disconnect entirely from the cognitive dissonance of his existence. He no longer had to reconcile the joyful musician on stage with the isolated man off stage. The chemical dependency provided a total, albeit destructive, erasure of that internal conflict. The recording industry's response to Preston's spiraling addiction reveals the transactional, often deeply cynical nature of the entertainment business during this era. There was no established infrastructure for intervention or rehabilitation provided by the corporate entities that profited from his labor. The prevailing culture among management and promoters was one of aggressive enablement, operating under the functional addict paradigm. As long as Preston could physically manage to arrive at a recording studio, sit behind a Hammond organ, and deliver the world-class performances expected of him, his rapid physical and psychological deterioration was systematically ignored. Those present during his recording sessions and tours in the late 1980s noted a stark transformation. The relentless use of cocaine began to exact a severe physiological toll. The chronic stimulation of his nervous system led to wild, unpredictable fluctuations in his weight. The profound exhaustion of living cycle to cycle between intense highs and agonizing withdrawals became visible. The artist, who had once dominated the stage at Madison Square Garden with boundless athletic energy, now frequently appeared drawn, erratic, and deeply fatigued. Furthermore, the prolonged substance abuse began to systematically damage his cardiovascular system, initiating a silent crisis of severe hypertension that would eventually destroy his renal function in the years to come. The body, unable to sustain the toxic combination of chronic psychological stress and heavy narcotic abuse, was slowly failing. By the early 1990s, Preston's addiction had completely eclipsed his ability to manage his carefully curated public persona. The boundary between his private suffering and his public life, which he had successfully maintained since childhood, finally ruptured, resulting in a series of highly publicized legal and personal crises. In 1991, the public image of the affable, smiling fifth Beatle was permanently shattered when Preston was arrested in Los Angeles. The authorities charged him with assault and sexual battery, alleging that he had picked up a 16-year-old boy, brought him to his property, and attacked him. The incident, which resulted in the teenager escaping and contacting the police, generated a firestorm of media coverage. The press, which had largely protected his image for decades, immediately pivoted to sensationalize the arrest. For Preston, it was the realization of his deepest, most ingrained fear. His private life and his sexuality were suddenly subjected to ruthless, unforgiving public scrutiny under the worst possible circumstances. The legal consequences compounded rapidly, reflecting the chaotic, entirely unmanageable state of his daily existence. Following the 1991 arrest, he faced subsequent legal action when he was taken into custody for assaulting a day laborer with a weapon at his home. The judicial system, unlike the music industry, did not grant leniency based on past artistic achievements. In 1997, Preston's inability to overcome his addiction resulted in a critical violation of his probation. After submitting a drug test that returned positive for cocaine, a California judge sentenced the 50-year-old musician to 3 years in a state penitentiary. The contrast was absolute and deeply tragic. The musical prodigy who had dined with royalty, recorded at Abbey Road, and provided the rhythmic foundation for the defining anthems of the 20th century, was now an inmate within the severe, unforgiving environment of the California penal system. He was stripped of his instruments, his audience, and his dignity. The institutions of his youth, the church and the music industry, offered no sanctuary. The absolute nadir of this period of self-destruction occurred in 1998, shortly after navigating the penal and court-ordered rehabilitation systems. In an act that biographers often interpret as a manifestation of profound despair and the literal destruction of his own legacy, Preston was arrested and subsequently pleaded guilty to charges of insurance fraud. The court records detail that he had intentionally set fire to his own Los Angeles home in an attempt to collect the insurance payout. The destruction of his own property served as a stark physical metaphor for the state of his life. During this dark, protracted period of legal entanglement and incarceration, the corporate apparatus of the recording industry enacted a swift and total abandonment. The managers, executives, and labels that had generated millions of dollars from his talent quietly severed all ties. In the highly risk-averse climate of the 1990s music business, Preston was no longer viewed as a legendary pioneer or a commercially viable asset. He was categorized strictly as a legal liability and a public relations disaster. When he ceased to function as a reliable, predictable source of revenue, the industry that had demanded his silence and enabled his addiction simply erased him from their ledgers. Left entirely to his own devices, battling a relentless addiction and facing the severe physical consequences of his lifestyle, Billy Preston entered the final phase of his life bearing the profound scars of a system that had consumed his genius while systematically breaking the man himself. Decades of severe substance abuse and immense psychological strain eventually exacted an irreversible physical toll. By the late 1990s, Billy Preston had successfully navigated the penal system and completed court-ordered rehabilitation, effectively halting his active addiction to crack cocaine. However, the physiological damage inflicted upon his body during the preceding 2 decades was irreversible. The relentless stimulation of his nervous system by narcotics, combined with the extreme sustained stress of concealing his sexual orientation within a hostile industry, had severely compromised his cardiovascular health. Medical records and historical accounts from this period detail a profound struggle with chronic hypertension. High blood pressure, particularly when left unmanaged during years of active addiction and chaotic living, systematically damages the vascular system, with the kidneys often sustaining the most critical injuries. As Preston entered his 50s, an age when many of his contemporaries were embarking on lucrative, highly curated heritage tours, he was diagnosed with end-stage renal failure. The artist who had defined the kinetic physical energy of the 1970s stadium rock era was now bound to the grueling, exhausting schedule of regular dialysis treatments just to survive. Despite the severe, accelerating decline of his physical body, Preston's musical faculties remained remarkably pristine. The early 2000s witnessed a quiet, highly respected professional resurgence, driven not by the corporate record labels that had previously abandoned him, but by his fellow musicians who understood his foundational importance to modern music. He was sought out for his unparalleled proficiency on the Hammond organ and the piano. He contributed heavily to Eric Clapton's 2001 album Reptile and his 2004 Robert Johnson tribute, Me and Mr. Johnson. He provided the intricate keyboard foundations for Neil Diamond's critically acclaimed 2005 album 12 Songs. In one of his final recorded performances, he played the clavinet on the Red Hot Chili Peppers' 2006 album Stadium Arcadium. Audio engineers and producers present during these final sessions noted a stark dichotomy. Preston would arrive at the studios visibly frail, often requiring physical assistance to move from his wheelchair to the organ bench. The vibrant, imposing figure of his youth had been entirely eroded by disease. Yet the moment his hands contacted the keys, the physical limitations vanished. He delivered takes with the same rhythmic authority, gospel inflection, and complex harmonic understanding that had anchored the Beatles and the Rolling Stones decades prior. His musical output remained an impenetrable fortress, entirely unaffected by the collapse of his health. In 2002, in an attempt to halt the progression of his renal failure, Preston underwent a kidney transplant. The procedure provided a temporary reprieve, but his heavily compromised cardiovascular system ultimately rejected the organ. His health deteriorated rapidly following the failed transplant. In November 2005, the cumulative effects of hypertension and renal disease culminated in a severe case of pericarditis, an inflammation of the fibrous sac surrounding the heart, coupled with acute respiratory failure. The physiological cascade was catastrophic. He suffered an infection that forced him into a deep coma. Billy Preston remained on life support in a facility in Scottsdale, Arizona for several months. He never regained consciousness. He died on June 6, 2006, at the age of 59. The immediate aftermath of his death was characterized by prolonged complex litigation regarding his estate, reflecting the chaotic administrative reality of his final decades. Legal disputes arose rapidly between his surviving family members and his final management team over the control of his publishing rights, royalties, and physical assets. These court battles dragged on for years, a stark bureaucratic conclusion to a life defined by creative output. However, as the legal disputes eventually settled, the historical narrative surrounding Billy Preston began to undergo a necessary factual correction. In the decades following his passing, the cultural climate regarding the LGBTQ+ community, particularly within the Black American experience and the music industry, shifted significantly. The strict exclusionary parameters that had governed the 1970s and 1980s R&B markets were dismantled. This allowed biographers, musicologists, and historians to re-examine Preston's life and catalog with complete context. The industry that had demanded his silence finally acknowledged the reality of his existence. This delayed recognition culminated in 2021, when Billy Preston was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, receiving the Musical Excellence Award. The induction acknowledged his undeniable status as a primary architect of funk, soul, and rock keyboard playing. Yet, the true legacy of Billy Preston extends beyond his discography or his historic associations. The factual record of his life stands as a rigorous documentation of the severe human cost exacted by the mid-century American entertainment apparatus. He operated within a system that demanded exceptional artistry while simultaneously enforcing absolute conformity. His catalog remains a masterclass in musical execution, but it also functions as a permanent, coded archive of a man who utilized his genius to project immense joy to the world while enduring profound isolation in the shadows.